Hello and welcome to the Return of History Stuff, my YouTube channel in which I talk about subjects vaguely relating to history, as the title suggests, usually the medieval era and my own particular interest, which is the 13th century, or 13th century Britain, France and Ireland, I suppose. And to ease myself back in, I'm going to try and post a series of short mini biographies of famous figures from the period. And today I'm kicking off with one of the most famous, yet also one of the most obscure of them all, i.e. William Wallace. I'd imagine that most of us have heard of Wallace, mainly thanks to the infamous movie Braveheart, in which he's played by Mel Gibson. Everyone knows that that film is hugely inaccurate, but it did at least bring Wallace to a wider audience, so it had that benefit. But as I said, Wallace is quite unusual in that he is both famous and almost completely obscure. We still don't know a great deal about his background and his ancestry. We know that his father was Alan Wallace, a minor Scottish landholder who was a tenant of the Stuarts, later the Stuarts, one of the most important noble families in Scotland. But the Wallaces themselves were of no great importance at all. William's father might be the same Alan Wallace whose name appears on the Ragman Roll, which is a document dating from 1296, in which the seals of all the Scottish nobles who swore fealty to Edward I of England are attached. And it gives it a ragged look, hence the name, the Ragman Roll. But otherwise, we don't know anything about Alan. And nothing else about William's parentage. We don't know who his mother was, or anything certain about his ancestry. One theory is that he might have been Welsh in origin, because the name Wallace, or Le Wallace as it was spelt at the time, can translate as the Welshman. But that's informed speculation, really. Certainly Wallace, so far as we know, never described himself as a Welshman or of Welsh ancestry. We do know that he had two brothers, Malcolm and John, who occasionally appear in the record. We don't know Malcolm's fate, but John, sadly, was executed in much the same gory manner as William at Smithfield in London in about 1306. I think he was captured and executed shortly after William. But Malcolm just disappears. And whether any of the three brothers had any descendants, any children, we have no idea. Much of what we know or think we know about Wallace's early life comes from a poem composed by a Scottish minstrel named Blind Harry, who was writing a long time after Wallace's death, and made up a lot of romantic myths, shall we say, or well, nonsense really. And it was his poem that the screenwriters of Braveheart used as the template for the film, which is one reason why it is so inaccurate, although not as inaccurate as the poem, I should say. But the bare facts of Wallace's life, as we know them, I'll run through them as best I can. He first made his mark in the year 1297, when the Scots are starting to resist the invasion or occupation of Scotland. Edward I had invaded the previous year, 1296. He had deposed the King of Scots, John Balliol, who is an entirely different subject all to himself, and I won't go into Balliol and his context on this short video. Edward had taken the Scottish symbols of sovereignty. Famously, he took the stone of Scone, this piece of sandstone which Scottish kings had traditionally been crowned upon. And his intention is basically to turn Scotland into an appendage, a conquest of England. And as so far as he's concerned, there are going to be no more kings of Scotland, and Scotland is, in fact, no longer after centuries of existence, it is no longer an independent kingdom. It is now a land ruled from England. Also, Edward thinks. Um, and Edward was probably encouraged in this belief because the Scottish resistance in 1296 was pretty feeble, really. I mean, he manages to overrun the country, or much of it, within a matter of weeks. The Scottish army is defeated. All of the major towns and cities fall very quickly into Edward's hands. And he has probably thought, well, that's job done. And he turns around and races back south to go and deal with, in his eyes, a much more serious and damaging conflict with France. Um, but in his absence, things start to unravel in Scotland quite quickly. His administration was set up very hastily. His officials are very unpopular in Scotland, especially a chap named Hugh Cressingham, who is almost like a cartoon villain. Edward had made Cressingham the treasurer of Scotland, and his job was basically to extract as much tax money from the Scots as possible that could then be used to finance Edward's war against France. And to be fair to Cressingham, he's very good at this job, but he's too good, really. And he somehow manages to rake up over £5,000, which is a huge sum for the time, from the Scots. At the same time as Edward is demanding military service from the Scots, he wants them to go and fight for him against France, which causes a lot of resentment because that sort of demand was unprecedented, really. And in general, Edward's administration is, his new government in Scotland is perceived as oppressive. And the Scots are looking for a leader. The Scottish nobles haven't exactly covered themselves with glory, and it must be said that Robert the Bruce, the other famous Scottish resistance leader from this era, who will in the future win the Battle of Bannockburn and turf the English out of Scotland, and become King of Scots, at this point he's not a very impressive or successful figure. And when he and a number of other Scottish nobles try and rise against the English in 1297, they surrender very quickly. When Edward's captains rush into Scotland to put down this revolt, Bruce and his fellow nobles, they submit. They roll over without putting up much of a fight. But it's at this point that Wallace makes his presence felt. Not just him, it should be said. He had a friend, a comrade called Andrew Moray, who unfortunately tends to be neglected, sidelined a bit in favour of Wallace. But in fact, the revolt, the resistance that these two put up against the English in 1297 was very much a joint effort. It was the pair of them together. Wallace and Moray managed to raise an army after the Scottish nobles had surrendered to confront the English at Stirling Bridge, which is this crucial river crossing, which the River Forth basically cuts Scotland in two, and the bridge over the Forth and the castle of Stirling controlled that crossing. So it was vital for one side or the other to control Stirling Bridge and Stirling Castle, which is why so many battles were fought in the region. And the famous Battle of Stirling Bridge, September 1297, Wallace and Moray's great victory over the English took place there. And I'll probably make a separate video on the battle itself, but just quickly, what happens is that the English are lured into sending half of their army over this very narrow bridge, at which point Wallace and Moray suddenly attack. They swoop down from the hills to the north and they cut that half of the English army to pieces. They kill Cressingham, and according to folklore, Wallace had Cressingham flayed and made a sword belt out of his skin. I mean, that's how much Cressingham was hated. You can just imagine this grossly fat man being flayed and his skin being turned into a belt. It's pretty savage, and if it's true, suggests there was a fairly brutal side to Wallace's nature. And then the rest of the English army flees. The English panic and run away. And Wallace and Moray are left victorious. Unfortunately, or tragically, Moray was fatally wounded in the battle, and he dies shortly afterwards, which leaves Wallace as the sole leader of effective Scottish resistance. And he is shortly afterwards knighted and made Guardian of Scotland. He is now the head of the Guardians of Scotland, which the nobles of Scotland are not particularly happy about, because Wallace has basically upstaged them. He has done what they could not, and defeated the English, albeit temporarily. And they don't really have much choice except to, for the time being, agree to accept Wallace as their leader. But he's on very shaky ground. His position as Guardian, as head of the Scottish resistance, depends entirely on continuing to resist, effectively resist the English, and to keep on winning, basically. And if there's one thing for certain, it is that the English aren't going to just go away and accept defeat. Edward I, who is abroad at this time, he's definitely going to come back, and he'll be looking for payback. He'll be looking for revenge. So I meant to make this video quite short, and we're already running into 11 minutes. And I seem to have failed to get through the whole of Wallace's career in that short time. So I'll make this part 1. I should have said that at the beginning, but I didn't actually intend for there to be a part 2. But there'll have to be a part 2. So please bear with me, and I'll upload that when I can. Thank you for listening.